Strange Magic, written by Suzana Thompson, narrated by Sarah Sampino. Chapter 8. "Are you okay?" Duncan shouted. "Can you stand up?" I could barely see him as I squinted through the rain. "How did you—" Duncan stood up and leaned down to put his arms around me. "Hold on to me, Suzannah. I'll help you up." My legs easily held me. Duncan kept his arm around my waist as we walked toward his car. It was in the middle of the street, with the driver door wide open. He opened the passenger door, and I gratefully got in out of the rain. The keys were still in the ignition, with the engine running. The driver's side was wet from the rain. Not that it mattered, because both Duncan and I were dripping wet. Duncan's black hair was plastered to his head, while mine hung heavy against my back. He began to drive. The rain had lessened enough for the windshield wipers to be able to keep up with its steady rhythm. "How did you know that was going to happen?" I had a sense of déjà vu as I asked that question. "I didn't," Duncan said. "I just knew that I had to get to you." "But how did you know where I was?" I pushed my dripping hair off my forehead. "I don't know. I panicked and got in the car. Then I just drove to where you were. I was so concerned with getting to you in time that I didn't even think about how to find you. Somehow, I just did." He turned into a driveway and stopped the car. I noticed that we weren't at my house. "What are you doing? I need to go home and change." "You shouldn't be alone right now. You've had a shock. I'm sure my mom will let you borrow something of hers." I had no chance but to follow Duncan into his house. His mom met us at the door. "Duncan, I've been worried sick. You took off in such a rush with no explanation. My God, look at the two of you. You're soaking wet." "I'm sorry, Mom. There was no time. This is Suzannah." "Well, of course it is. She's exactly as you described her. Come now, Suzannah. Let's find you something dry to put on. Then I'll make you some tea to warm you up." She led me to her bedroom and found some clothes for me. I had to use a belt to hold up the pants, but it was a relief to get out of my wet clothes. Mrs. McKenna waited in the hallway until I was done. She insisted on taking my wet clothes to throw in the dryer. "They should be dry by the time you're done with your tea." She smiled at me. Duncan had apparently inherited his eyes from her. They were the exact same shade of palest blue. Duncan joined us in the kitchen. He had changed into dry clothes, too. I suddenly remembered that he had saved my life. "Thank you," I told him silently. "None of that," Mrs. McKenna said. "There's no need for secrets here." I turned to her in surprise and spoke aloud. "You could hear that?" "Strong emotions, Suzannah. You two are both overwhelmed with them. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop." "Mom, Suzannah just barely escaped being struck by lightning." "You too." It had suddenly dawned on me. "Duncan, you could have been hit too when you were pushing me out of the way." "Oh my God!" Mrs. McKenna exclaimed, but Duncan and I were looking at each other. Duncan cleared his throat. "That reminds me. Why did you get off the bus?" I looked away. "I just felt like walking." "In a storm?" "I thought I could beat it home." His mom intervened. "You've both had a close call. You need to try to calm down. The tea will be done in a minute." "Mom thinks tea cures everything," Duncan teased. "It's soothing, at least. I'm in a state myself. When I think about you being in danger, thank God you're okay." It was amazing how comfortable Duncan's mom made me feel. I could tell that she and Duncan were very close. He was relaxed around her. Within a short time, I felt all the tension of the day drain out of me as I drank tea with them. "So, you can read minds too." This fascinated me. I had thought that Duncan's parents weren't aware of his ability. Mine wouldn't believe such a thing was possible. "Yes," Mrs. McKenna said. "Duncan's father could, too." "Could?" Maybe it would disappear as suddenly as it appeared, I hoped. "Dad died 4 years ago," Duncan explained. "Oh, I'm sorry." I felt terrible for Duncan. I couldn't imagine losing my dad. "Thank you," Mrs. McKenna said. Duncan told me that you weren't aware of your ability until recently. Yes, I didn't even know it was possible. I couldn't believe it at first. You're the only two people I've ever met who could do this. Mrs. McKenna warmed to her subject. There is a theory that everyone has this ability. Some of us are just more easily able to access it. Our brains make the connections more readily. It's just like being good at math. Those who are tend to show an aptitude at an early age. Perhaps you just didn't know that you were hearing other people's thoughts. Your parents might have made you believe that it was all in your imagination. I shook my head. No, there was nothing like that. I never even had an imaginary friend. I've always been ordinary, until now. You're not ordinary, Suzana, Duncan said. Then he stood up abruptly and began to clear our empty cups from the table. I should get you home. Your parents will be home soon. Mrs. McKenna stood up too. I'll check if your clothes are dry. I got up and walked over to where Duncan was standing by the sink. I want to thank you again for saving my life. I'm just glad that you're okay, he said. I'm glad that you're okay too. We both smiled. It was nice to finally have this peaceful, easy feeling between us. His mom returned my clothes. They were dry, and I went back to her bedroom to put them on. The rain had stopped, but there were puddles everywhere. I was seized with the childish urge to splash in them. I resisted, since I didn't want to add more water to the interior of Duncan's car. Everything seemed perfect now. It was wonderful to be alive. Hey, Susie! Caitlin was avoiding the puddles as she made her way up the sidewalk toward us. Hi, Duncan. Hi, Caitlin. I was just about to drive Susannah home. Actually, she's going to have dinner at my house. Mom will drive her home. Caitlin was beyond thrilled to find me at Duncan's house. Even Duncan was wise to it. Yes, you girls have a lot to talk about. Okay then, have a good night. You too, we both replied. I called Mom to let her know I was at Caitlin's house. Caitlin had the frustration of actually having to wait through dinner before she could find out how I had ended up at Duncan's house. She kept giving me hurry-up looks as I was eating. Then we went up to her room on the pretext of studying. I had expected her to ask a million questions, but she only gasped and stared at me wide-eyed while I related the events of the afternoon. After I was finished, she sat in stunned silence. I looked at the clock. I really should get going now. Thanks for dinner. Caitlin grabbed my arm. Susie, she said slowly. Why did you do that? I looked at her blankly. Do what? She was more agitated than I had ever seen her. Why did you go out into the storm when you knew what was going to happen? How could I know? Duncan was the one who knew. No, she continued stubbornly. You knew too. Why do you think that? Because, Caitlin burst out. You knew about me. Knew what about you? Caitlin, you're not making any sense. Look, Susie, I know you don't like to talk about it. I've respected that all these years, but this is important. Ignoring this thing almost got you killed today. I stared at her. What are you talking about? I'm completely lost here. She stared back at me. Are you serious? You really don't know what I'm talking about? No, I said helplessly. I really don't. Wow. Caitlin began to pace back and forth. Okay. She stopped in front of me again. Do you remember how we became friends? Sure, I said. You started talking to me in second grade. No, Caitlin denied. You started talking to me first. You came up to me on the playground one day out of the blue. You grabbed my hand and told me not to go on the bus with my parents. A chill went through me. I did? I whispered. She went on with a nod. I'll never forget it. You were talking to me, but your eyes weren't focused on me. It seemed like you were looking somewhere far away. You repeated it again. Don't go on the bus with your mom and dad or you'll die. I was totally spooked. You know the rest. I did. It was legend in Caitlin's family. Her parents had still been together back then. They had planned a trip to visit her grandma in West Virginia. That morning, they couldn't find Caitlin anywhere. Frantic, they had called the police. By the time they found her, they had missed the bus. She had snuck out of the house early that morning and hidden a tree in the park. She had refused to tell them why. I knew that the bus had tragically gone over a cliff. There were no survivors. Caitlin's mom had often talked about how Caitlin had saved all their lives by hiding in that tree. I didn't remember the other part of it at all. We never talked about it. I figured you wanted to keep it a secret since you never said anything. For a long time, I was convinced that you were my guardian angel. I stuck close to you after that. You made me feel safe. I gaped at Caitlin. Are you making this up? Why would I make it up? Are you telling me that you really don't remember? You saved my life and just forgot about it?